Can everybody hear me? Y'all hear me out now? All right. We're gonna call the Natural Resources Committee to order. Can everybody hear me? At this time, I'm gonna ask. Y'all hear me out now? Lead us in a word of prayer. We're gonna.
All right, y'all pray with me, please.
We're going to
Dear Heavenly
call
Father, we just
the
thank
Natural
you
Resources
for today. We thank you for loving us.
Committee
Thank you
to
for the
order.
gift of salvation.
Can everybody hear me?
Lord, we thank you
At this
for the
time, I'm going to
opportunity
ask.
to be gathered here.
Y'all hear me out now? Lead us in a word of prayer.
Go about
We're
doing
gonna-
the people's
we're gonna-
business. And Lord, we just ask that you be with us and guide us, pray with give me, us please. wisdom and
We're
discernment.
gonna call
Father,
the
we just thank you
Natural
for the
Resources
blessings you today. We
Committee
thank thank you
to
for
order.
loving us.
Committee
Please
to
continue
order.
with salvation.
Can
Bless us
everybody hear me?
individually, our
At this
families,
time, I'm going to
and
ask.
gathered here.
Y'all hear me out
Great
now?
people of the
Lead
great
us in a
state of
word.
Georgia and the United States of America.
we're
In
gonna-
Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen.
Be with us and guide us, give us wisdom and
At this
discernment.
time, I
Father, we
want
just
to
thank you for the blessings
welcome
you
all the
bestowed upon us.
board
Loving us,
committee
please
members
continue
here.
with salvation.
Can
Bless us
everybody hear me?
individually, our
At this
families,
time, I'm going to
and
ask.
gathered here.
Y'all hear me
Great
out now?
people of the
Lead
great
us in a
state of
word.
Georgia and the
Person
United
on
States
the
of
Senate
America.
Doing
In Jesus'
Committee.
name we pray, amen.
Amen.
Be with us and guide us, give us
The only
wisdom
problem I
and
see with
discernment.
him
Lord,
is
we
he
just thank
don't
you
look
for
as
the
good as the
blessings
former
upon us.
board
Loving us,
committee
please
members
continue
here.
with salvation.
Can
Bless us
everybody hear me?
individually, our
At this
families,
time,
and
I'm going to ask.
gathered here.
Y'all hear me out
Great
now?
people of the great state of Georgia and the
Person
United
on
States
that
of
Senate
America.
Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. Amen. And if everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some pies. Committee members here to give away. Can everybody hear me? At this time, anytime you want to bring something,
the great state of Georgia and the
person on that Senate Doing Committee, Drew
Amen.
Eccles. Amen. And if everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some pies. Committee members here to give away. Can everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime you want to bring something. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. Amen. Businessman, if take everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some pies. Committee members here to give away. Can everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime you want to bring something. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, if take everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some pies. Committee members here. Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime you want to bring something. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some tables. Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime situation is happening. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some tables. Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime situation is happening. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some tables. Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime situation is happening. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some tables. Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime situation is happening. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some tables. Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime situation is happening. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some tables. Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime situation is happening. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some tables. Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime situation is happening. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some tables.
Last week,
Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime situation is happening. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he don't look as good as he's got some tables.
last week,
Today is just everybody hear me? Glad to have anytime situation is happening. Today is that Senate Doing Committee, Drew Eccles. All in favor, businessman, everybody's problem I see with him is he
I'll say part of our ongoing surveillance has included tabletop exercises, and we've been preparing for the information that we got last week, again, for the last several years. The one thing that I want to say as I sit before you today is know that deer hunting is still fine in Georgia. We're going to be fine even though we have joined 35 other states that have chronic wasting disease. It's going to take all of us working together, this body, the House. It's going to take hunters. It's going to take all Georgians. It's not just those of us that hunt, but we're going to need everyone's cooperation in managing, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to manage chronic wasting disease. It's not going to go away, as you'll hear from Dr. Johansson in just a minute, but we're going to maintain our healthy deer herd here in Georgia. We know, we recognize, and we partner with our hunters and landowners. They play the major role in helping us at the agency with managing CWD, and we look forward to working with them certainly in the future. You'll continue to see the communication with the public, and most of you know that DNR, if we're not the most transparent agency in state government, we're one of the most transparent agencies in state government. And I thank the chairman for inviting us here today right after the positive confirmation of this disease. Before I turn it over to Dr. Johansson, I would like to say how proud I am of the staff. You know, you've got a small smattering of our staff here with you today. As we speak, there are boots on the ground going around to taxidermists, deer processors. Our communication staff are busy getting out press releases, talking with the media. You can imagine the amount of inquiries that we have received over the last several days, over the weekend, and it's just an honor and a privilege to work with these professionals day in and day out, but particularly when we're faced with a challenge such as we're challenged with at this point in time. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. Johansson. She's going to provide you with the details of this disease and talk to you a little bit about our strategy moving forward to manage this disease. And that'll be, again, there's a PowerPoint presentation in your package if you want to follow her slide by slide.
Thank you, Commissioner. Can y'all hear me? Alrighty. So why are we here today to talk about chronic wasting disease? Well, for one thing, hunting in Georgia is a very important economic driver. The white-tailed deer is actually our state mammal here in Georgia. White-tailed deer are responsible for about $1.6 billion in economic impact in Georgia, or I should say hunting and white-tailed deer for about $1.6 billion in economic impact. That equates to about 150,000 jobs. We have about 600,000 hunters in our state. Their license purchases and equipment purchases result in generating $23 million in Pittman-Robertson funds.
Mr. Chairman, can I interrupt a minute? I know all of our guests out here don't have a PowerPoint in their hand. Is there a way to put it on the screen?
Have y'all brought it?
I don't think we have a thumb drive with it on there, do we?
If they want a copy, we'll get them a copy.
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine. So we harvest about 280,000 deer annually in the state of Georgia. So deer are, I think, a pretty big deal. So what is this disease we speak of, chronic wasting disease, or CWD? Well, technically, it's a degenerative neurological disease that affects members of the deer family, specifically deer, elk, and moose. It's caused by an infectious, misshapen prion protein. Once infected, it takes a deer about 18 to 30 months before it starts to show symptoms and signs. So it has a very long incubation period. 100% of infected deer will die. There are no treatments, no vaccines, no medications you can give to a deer. It will die. They don't develop immunity to it. That incubation period is so long that most deer that are infected with CWD end up dying from something else, whether it's predators, getting hit by a car, or harvested by a hunter. Long before they become symptomatic, something else may take them out. During most of that 18 to 30-month incubation period, deer look like this picture. They look perfectly healthy. It looks like a normal deer. It's only in the final few weeks or months of the course of the disease that they start to take on that wasted appearance from which it gets its name. During that incubation period, at some point, they do begin to shed these infectious prions, contaminating the environment and potentially infecting other deer. You don't see deer like this picture, sick, obviously ill deer, until the prevalence is very high, meaning that a significant proportion of the local deer herd have been infected. And the symptoms are similar to those seen with some other more common diseases. You'll see dramatic weight loss. You'll see droopy heads, droopy ears, maybe drooling. They're going to act very lethargic. They're not going to want to behave like a normal deer. But again, this is only in the last few months or even weeks. The image here is of a deer infected with CWD out of Pennsylvania. So we can't just look for sick deer. We have to routinely sample apparently healthy deer. And this is why our routine surveillance is needed to catch it when the prevalence is low. So how does CWD spread? Well, it moves long distances when people put live deer in a truck and haul them somewhere. It initially started spreading from Colorado, made it into Canada. That was not natural spread. That was deer in a trailer being trucked from one facility to another. And it continues to be the #1 way that CWD gets transported from one location to another. Our main concern is direct contact between deer. That's how one deer infects another deer once it gets established in a location. Deer move in social groups. They have contact with each other. They shed these prions and bodily fluids, including saliva, urine, and feces. It takes repeated exposures, and that's why you see it spread from a deer to another deer within these social groups that they tend to hang around in. A bigger concern for states that have a captive cervid industry of some sort, whether it's pen-raised deer, elk, farmed deer of some kind, there is an indirect route that this disease can spread. The environment gets contaminated either through these bodily fluids or infectious carcass parts on the landscape. And that's why we have a prohibition against moving parts around and why we have a prohibition against moving live deer around. So what if we do nothing? Unlike other diseases that come and go as survivors develop immunity, CWD steadily spreads if it's not managed. Eradication, once it's established in a wild population, is not feasible. Over time, a larger geographic area becomes contaminated as prevalence increases. So think of it as most diseases, for example, blue tongue or epizootic hemorrhagic disease. You may have heard of summertime deer getting sick. Blue tongue is like a roller coaster. It's on a cycle. It goes up in late summer when it's real dry, then it falls off. You may not see it for a couple of years. You may see another outbreak. Deer develop immunity. Here in Georgia, because as y'all know, we have biting insects almost year-round here in Georgia, our deer herd is very much immune to routine cycles of hemorrhagic disease or blue tongue. That's not how it happens with chronic wasting disease. Instead of it being a roller coaster or a cycle, it's more like an escalator. It's there in very, very low numbers over time. And if you don't manage it to keep it in those low numbers, it'll go up like an escalator. And you'll just have more and more of your deer that are infected. As they move out across the landscape, more and more of the geographical area will be affected. If you look at the map of the United States, that shows the current distribution of CWD. It does include Georgia now. If you look at the counties there in Colorado, that is where the disease was first discovered and described. It went into Canada, it went into Wisconsin, it went into several other places through the movement of live deer. For a long time it wasn't in the southeast, but it's in the southeast now as well. If you turn to the next page, you can see the distribution in the states adjacent to Georgia. Hats off to South Carolina. They're the last man standing. All the other states around us do now have confirmed cases of CWD in their borders.
Dr. Johansson,
Yes, sir.
the deer that was found in Georgia,
Yes,
was
sir.
it trucked in from somewhere, or, I mean, I'm not seeing any docks close by,
Correct.
so.
We don't yet know where that deer came from or how it got there. Right at the moment, it's still R1 positive, so it would be premature to speculate where it may have come from, but we are doing an active investigation to try to determine if it's a local deer, where it may have come from, and then, of course, collecting samples to see if it has spread. So, of course, our first concern is human health and safety. The good news, if there is any today, is that CWD has not been shown to infect people. According to the Centers for Disease Control, no cases of CWD have ever been documented in people. That said, they do recommend that hunters who are in an area where it is known that there are CWD positive animals, they recommend that hunters in those management areas consider having their deer tested before they consume it. I'd like to emphasize that they recommend testing only within the immediate area of a positive deer. It's just one small area of Georgia. It's a very conservative recommendation. Keep in mind also that this disease has been on the landscape in Colorado and other parts of the West and in Canada for 50 years now. And there has yet to be a documented case in humans. So, our surveillance and prevention program has been in place now since 2002. We've been doing statewide surveillance since then. We worked with the legislature to prohibit the importation of live deer and carcasses from CWD positive states back in 2005. As more states around us discovered CWD within their borders, we further amended that prohibition in 2022 to prohibit the importation of carcasses from any surrounding states. This made it simpler for hunters and just made it a more conservative approach. Over the years, our law enforcement division has investigated unlawful importations of live deer and tested those. None of them, fortunately, have tested positive for CWD. We've increased our surveillance around captive deer facilities and moved to a risk-based model that takes into account things like captive facilities, distance to the border, distance to the nearest positive case, to dictate the sampling that we do on a county-by-county basis. If you look at this map with the red counties, you can see that those counties that are adjacent to Alabama, which has positive cases, and now the Florida Panhandle, we do increased surveillance in those counties. That said, every county in Georgia has been under surveillance since 2002 and will continue to be part of our routine surveillance moving forward. So where did we find it? We found it on the Berrien-Lanier County line, down in South Georgia. As the commissioner mentioned, this was part of our routine surveillance. There was nothing about that deer to indicate to the hunter that it had anything wrong with it. And I'd like to thank that hunter and that landowner. They have been amazing cooperating with us since they were notified last week when we got the positive. Counties that touch a 5-mile radius will be included in our CWD management area. Fortunately, right now, that's just the 2 counties of Berrien and Lanier. Should we discover more positives, we may need to expand that management area, but hopefully it'll stay just the 2 counties. So what's DNR been doing since we got this positive notification last week? Feels like it's been a lot longer than a week. We immediately activated our CWD response plan. We've had this plan in place for quite some time. It's been very much an adaptive plan, and we just flipped the switch on it. The hunter and the landowner were immediately notified. The location where the deer was harvested was identified. That is the ground zero point of our efforts right now. We've already contacted the landowners within a 1-mile radius of that initial positive and are actively working with them to collect some more samples. And then our staff immediately dispersed in the area, contacting processors and taxidermists. We just finished the firearms season here in Georgia, and we were able to get up with those folks, and a few of them did have some samples on hand or some heads on hand that we were able to get additional samples from. So we've just had incredible cooperation and participation from stakeholders in the area. Upon immediately activating our response plan, a whole bunch of public outreach happens. We did a press release the next day, updated our website with all the latest information. We held a press conference on Friday down in Tifton for local media to come in and spend as much time with us talking and answering questions as they needed. We've been blasting social media, answering questions, putting information out. We're going to continue to do that. We've been answering questions pretty much all waking hours since this was discovered. We have public meetings scheduled in person on the ground down in that area, Valdosta, Lakeland. We will also have a virtual public meeting. We started doing those in 2020 with COVID, with our regulation meetings, and they were a big hit. I mean, we'll have 50, 100 people participate. So we're going to have a virtual meeting for anyone to attend, to ask questions, hear the same information that we're sharing now. And we will continue to update information online. We will continue to answer questions and maintain a frequently asked questions through our different outlets to ensure that people are getting the best, most accurate, and up-to-date information. In addition to that public outreach, we immediately began searching for additional samples. As I mentioned, within that 1-mile radius, we've reached out to the landowners and asked them or their hunters or their designee to collect samples, to harvest deer for us that we can sample. We're looking to get about 20 to 30 samples, not a whole lot of deer, not looking to wipe out the deer. We're looking to focus on deer in that area that are most likely to have had contact with the positive. We've also reached out to crop damage permit holders, and we'll continue to reach out to them to collect deer that are going to be taken anyway, to get samples from those. And of course, we've always collected roadkill deer to the extent that we can. They are good test subjects for CWD. We'll be doing this until deer season starts in September. And then we will be, of course, focusing on our hunter harvested deer as we always have. What is the point of these additional sampling efforts? We'd like, before deer season starts, to assess the prevalence and geographic extent of this outbreak. We want to know the percentage of deer that test positive, and we want to know the geographic extent of this outbreak. So fortunately, while CWD is somewhat easy to contract in the sense that it's just nose-to-nose contact, it's not easily contracted. So deer do need repeated contacts with each other. And what that means is the deer most likely to get CWD from an infected deer are the ones in its social group. Those of you who hunt or sit on your deck and watch the deer decimate your landscape shrubbery, you've noticed that they'll be in groups of 3 or 5. The deer that are hanging out with that positive deer are far more likely, right, to have CWD. So this is not a random shotgun approach when we're collecting these samples. This is a very focused effort to get those deer most likely to test positive. And we call this cluster sampling. So we're gonna do this cluster sampling in cooperation with the landowners and the hunters. DNR is not gonna go out there and shoot a bunch of deer to test. We're gonna work with the folks who are there to get additional samples. We will be focusing on the area where that positive was found, literally that property and the adjacent properties, particularly within that 1 mile radius. And we're coaching these folks on trying to get those deer that were most likely hanging out with the positive deer. So this cluster sampling that I just described is not used to reduce local deer densities. It occurs at the property level. All of this sampling is being conducted by landowners and managers in cooperation with DNR. We are not contemplating significant herd reductions. It's not a tool we feel is appropriate for managing CWD in our state. Our surveillance and monitoring will continue to be primarily from hunter-harvested deer or deer that die for other reasons, such as road kills or deer that are taken under the authority of a crop damage permit. This will be our focus from now until deer season. Come deer season, as I said, we'll be using our existing surveillance model to continue collecting samples and monitoring the entire state. This is a long-term process. We're gonna try to keep our prevalence low, ideally below 5%. We'll continue increased surveillance to monitor how far this has spread. We will continue providing access to testing for hunters. We already have the infrastructure in place and have for a couple of years now where if a hunter, regardless of where they are in the state, says, I'd like to get this deer tested, I've heard about this disease, they can contact the regional office closest to them. They can submit that head, we'll pull a sample, submit it to the lab for them. There is a cost for that. Within the surveillance area, we'll be bearing the burden of the cost for those deer. Outside of the 2 counties, any hunter can get a deer tested if they wish to pay for that. Obviously, we'll be increasing our testing quite a bit within the CWD management area. Our goal is to maintain Georgia's rich deer hunting heritage for future generations. As I said, this is a marathon. This is not a sprint. We're in this for the long haul now. And the reason we're focusing on this cluster sampling methodology is if you look at the graph there in front of you, you'll see a green line that from 2002 to 2018 stays fairly flat. That is the state of Illinois, which has had, they don't actually now, but for a long time they were doing this approach where you go into where there was a positive and you focus very surgically on removing deer that probably could have had contact with your positive, right? And they did this year after year after year. Again, not a random shotgun approach, not trying to go in there and just get rid of all the deer, but a very focused, thoughtful effort. And they kept their prevalence quite low, well below 5%. That is our goal. By contrast, through no fault of their own, the state of Wisconsin became somewhat of a natural experiment. They were the first to find CWD this side of the Mississippi River. Their deer hunting heritage is as good as ours. They may have 1 or 2 more big deer than we do. They came in strong, did a lot of this sampling. Their state, their hunters, their stakeholders got tired of it. It was very expensive. And they ended up not doing that anymore. They were using sharpshooters to go in and remove those deer. They stopped doing it altogether. And as I told y'all, if we do nothing, this is what happens. Their prevalence went up like the escalator that I described. It just starts out slow. If you don't control it, it gets high pretty fast. When you start getting up there around 15% like they are, that's when you're gonna start seeing sick deer on the landscape, and we would like to avoid that. Just to wrap up, a few key takeaways. We've been planning and preparing for this since 2002. Our response plan has evolved in those 22 years, monitoring the 35 states that found this before we did. We've been fortunate to watch the things that they've tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and our plan is very focused on what works and suiting Georgia's needs. This management will be conducted locally and in cooperation with landowners and hunters. We may have gotten lucky, but most likely CWD is here to stay. It's going to require continual surveillance and adaptive management over the long term to protect our deer herd and our heritage. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Doc, when you said they would take, roadkill, how long can you test a deer that's been killed?
That's a great question. So, not very long. It needs to be a pretty fresh sample, particularly in the summertime. I wouldn't want one more than a day or so old. So the tissue that we take for the testing is a lymph node right under the jaw. And so you can imagine that that doesn't stay fresh. It's just a little piece of tissue there. And so it has to be pretty fresh. But for years now, our staff have been advised if you can safely pull over and pull a sample from a roadkill, cut the head off, bring it back to the office, get that sample out, and get it sent off for testing.
And also, have we reached out to all the animal control, the counties, to, if they collect the deer, to notify y'all to get a sample?
We have not. We are actually working to contact the Department of Transportation to get the local contacts for those counties, and then as we move out, to try to, some counties handle it differently,
Right.
Whether they collect them and then what they do with them once they do collect them. And so we're working on a very local level with those folks to try to get additional samples that way.
Okay. All right, who's, number 5, Senator Harbin?
Thank you, appreciate it. Am I correct, there is no harm to a human from the disease? It is the disease only to other deer, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Is there a testing methodology that's, could be done without chopping off the head, sending the head in? Is there anything that can be done to make it easier? Because I hear your roadkill, and of course during the rut or whatever, you've
Right.
got plenty of samples as far as that. And I see also within the counties that I represent, there are populations where very little hunting is done, and there are an abundance of deer. And then there's other counties that is sparse comparatively. You actually could hunt out of your backyard better than you can out of
Right.
the farmland. But is there a way to test that either a hunter or a processor, somebody that's processing deer, can test that deer in a fairly quick way? Or is it all what you're saying, you'll have to go in and you've got to do it within a 2-day period of time, is what I'm understanding, correct?
Unfortunately, the only approved test for CWD right now does require that the animal be dead and that lymph node tissue be removed and sent off for testing. So there isn't a quick way for a hunter or a processor to test deer as they come in. So we do collect these samples and try to get those back as quickly as we can. 2 weeks is about the fastest that we can get them turned around, and certainly during busy times of the deer season, it may take a little bit longer. There are advertisements online for what are advertised as quick tests for prions. Those tests have not been proven or approved to be reliable, so we don't recommend that. Those results are just not something that have been evaluated.
And the only way to, there's not a cure for it from what you're saying as well, so the only way to deal with it is extinction, or going in, if you find a herd, is just taking the herd down. Am I correct?
Certainly in a captive situation, yes, you would need to come in and completely depopulate it. In the wild, like what we're talking about, now you're in a management situation. It's there, how do you manage it? And the big things are public education, making sure everybody knows what it is and where it is so that they can make educated decisions about how they want to proceed with the management of their deer herd.
In my deer hunting experiences, deer usually are within a 3 to 5 mile territory, I'll call it, as far as that portion. They don't go from county to county
Correct.
to county. Am I correct?
Yes, sir, you are correct.
Okay. Okey-doke. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Senator Brass, Chairman Brass, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have y'all looked into any kind of like AI camera type stuff? Commissioner, I sent you a link to a company that is actually out of Carroll County, and they take trail camera pictures, and then with the AI, they can start identifying the symptoms like the droopy ears, the droopy neck, head, all that stuff, the drooling, and then you can filter out. You can start to filter out to get those pictures, and that might be a way to help kind of identify it. At least if you had that some sort of system like that in an infected area, like down there in Berrien County, it might be worth something looking into. So,
Yes,
just
sir.
throwing that out there, and I sent you that link.
Thank you.
Senator Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are the deer contagious from day one, or is it later in the incubation period of this disease, or can it be transmitted as soon as they get it?
It is not as soon as they get it. That's a great question. So it does take some time for the prions to build up in their body, and so it tends to spread out through certain tissues first. And the first tissue that you see it in is that this lymph node is one of the first tissues that you see it in. So to answer your question, no, we don't know exactly at what point in that long incubation period they start shedding prions, and at what point it starts to accelerate. But we do know that by the time they die, they're eat up with it, for lack of a better term.
Okay, thank you.
Senate again.
Dr. Hanson said two things. One of them is on the deer, and I don't know, what's happening with economics in other states that have had this for a long time on hunting, that they're really impact their, what's going on with their hunting. And then the other one is.
You got it light
We're
on.
talking about,
You got your
CWD.
light on.
It was on. That's not.
It's on this side.
All right, got you.
Okay,
No,
maybe it's working. Y'all hear that?
I think we can
So
hear,
the other thing is.
I think we can hear you loud and clear.
The other question is when I look at, CWD compared to mad cow disease, to the, any relation, I just don't know enough about the science, I'm not a biologist, so.
So to your first question, as this disease has gone through these 35 states, early on, states did see dramatic declines in hunting license sales and economic activity associated with hunting. But after a year or so, it would rebound. And I think there's a learning curve among hunters about the real versus the perceived threat of this particular disease. And so as each state has kind of fallen like dominoes, there's been less and less of an economic impact, fortunately. And so we may see a slight decline now that we are positive. We hope it will only be slight and that it will recover quickly, because this is such an important economic source for our rural counties, and not to mention controlling our deer herds in general. Relative to mad cow disease, they are in the same family. They are spongiform encephalopathies, which basically means it turns your brain into a sponge. And it's rather disconcerting on a slide to look at it. The good news is mad cow never should have gotten into people. It never really should have been in cows the way that it was. That was an issue with how those cattle were fed, handled, processed, and then people were allowed to eat it. And we've learned a lot from that. Thus far, it appears, probably because deer don't eat each other, I mean, that's part of what happened with mad cow. It does not appear that same thing happens with chronic wasting disease in people.
Thank you.
Commissioner, with catching this, hopefully we're catching it. We knew it was gonna happen sometime or another. But catching it, hopefully this early, and it being we in session and we doing budget hearings now, is it anything that, where we could help financial to even keep this on a very low scale?
Absolutely. So there are going to be some needs. One thing that we've done thus far, we've been able to do this random sampling with the staff that we currently have. A test, and I don't think that we covered it, but a test is about $25 to get it sent off to the lab, get it tested and all that. So as Dr. Johansson said, we've been able to handle that internally up until this point. So there are some needs. We could use a a disease biologist, for a lack of a better term. There's probably a better title for this individual, but someone that's sole focus is to focus on tracking, getting the samples to the lab, that kind of thing. And then the other part that we will start next deer season, we're going to put freezers all around these CWD zones, particularly Lanier and Berrien counties, so that hunters can bring their deer voluntarily and have them tested. So the more freezers that we have out there, the more, hopefully, the more samples we can get, and we can detect more prevalence. All of that comes at a cost that we have not budgeted for. So yes, sir, we do have some needs, and I could probably get some dollar amounts to you after the meeting.
Do we have any, funds or state money that we need in the budget to where, is it any federal, funds that comes down to help with this disease?
Yes, sir. So if we could come up with some state funds, we can multiply that times 3
3 times federal, okay.
with federal Pittman Robertson funds. Yes, sir.
Okay. And that funds that we get from the feds, would that be, can we spend that money toward the what you just
Absolutely.
spoke on?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. Well, when do you think you'll have that number
This afternoon.
to us? Okay. All right. Any other questions? I want to thank. Okay. Senator Moore?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How does the freezer thing work? So a hunter harvests the deer and then they just give the whole deer to DNR and they leave it in the freezer, or they just, how does that work?
Just the head.
Just the head?
So if it's
Okay.
a buck that they want to keep, they can saw the skull cap off, leave us the head. If it's a doe, they can cut just the head off. And of course, there'll be many educational efforts on how to do that.
Okay.
But yes, just the head. They take the deer, the meat, the rest of the deer.
What is the average lifespan of a deer, normal deer, and healthy deer?
3-5 years. Bucks don't live as long as does for
Okay.
obvious reasons, but you know, if you've got a 7 or 8 year old doe, that's not uncommon.
So this sickness really shows itself at like 60-70% of its lifespan then?
Right.
It could. The deer that tested positive was only 2.5
only
years
2.5.
old.
Okay. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And also, I want to say that, I believe, Commissioner, y'all will be putting this on the website so anybody can look it up.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Please help us get this information out. If, again, as I said earlier, if you have questions or if your constituents have questions, forward them to us, because the more we educate, not just hunters, but all Georgians on what this is. Like I said, I'm sure that all of us eat deer. The better off we all are. It's going to be a team effort to manage this.
And we all know that it brings in a lot of revenue for the state of Georgia.
Yes,
for
sir.
us. And we need to keep it as low as possible. So thank you for meeting with us this quick. And thank all the committee members for showing up today. I would ask for Senator Jones to see me after committee. I got something for you. Okay.
Thank you.
George Peanuts.
We are adjourned. Thank you. Just put that on my desk.
If a deer was hit by a car, because we're on a dirt road,